There was a lot of controversy in the press about it. Living Colour talked about it on stage. And then ultimately Axl comes out. Effectively, the band breaks up on stage. He announces right there at that concert, these are going to be the last Guns N' Roses shows you ever see. They just want to really deliver something that is mind-blowing and trying something totally new. GNR actually delivered. They hit a home run with it. To me, that gave them a legacy that they wouldn't have had if they had fallen apart after Appetite, which I suppose could have happened.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Before we get started, I want to thank Darren and Brent from the Bogus Soda Show for having me on their podcast to talk about the 40th anniversary of Van Halen's 5150. The Bogus Soda Show is it's a great Sammy Hagar fan podcast. So check that out. You can find it wherever you get your favorite podcasts. All right, so let's get to our guest. We are going to be talking about Guns N' Roses today. Jeff Harkness is back on the show. He's got a book out titled Estranged, Guns N' Roses, and Use Your Illusion. Jeff, great to see you again.
Hey, good to see you, man. Thanks for having me. Always great to be back on the Ultimate Rock Book podcast.
Nice, man. I was saying I listened to your interview on the Appetite for Distortion podcast. Great interview.
Yeah.
This is quite an endeavor for you. How long did it take you to put this one together?
A doorstop. Yeah, right. A couple of years of writing and working on this. It's such a huge story. They, covered such a long period of time. And then also the tour was, almost 200 shows and all these different legs and touring with different bands and the co-tour with Metallica. So it took a long time to go through it. And I think I watched every single concert, looked at all the videos, read a ton of stuff and, just spent a couple years really deep diving into the Illusion era, which was very fun because I'm a huge GNR fan.
Yeah, I remember that era very well. I was in high school when Appetite for Destruction came out, and then just leaving high school, getting into college when Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 came out, and they were arguably the biggest rock and roll band around at that point.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They were huge. One of the things that I really kind of came to appreciate more in this book was exactly how famous Axl Rose was. He couldn't leave his hotel. Anytime he stepped out, he had to have bodyguards. He had to have security, extra security. They had to use decoy, limos and stuff like that. He wasn't somebody who could just go out to a club or something like that without a lot of preparation, really. And I don't know if I realized the level of fame that he had.
Sure. And also you talked about in that interview about how he was kind of felt like a race car. They had for each show, he had like a team of people, chiropractors and you name it, whatever, just to get him ready for each show. And he also he couldn't go out and party like the other guys in the band or maybe stay up late. He always had to be ready and on for each show.
Yeah. And also, something else I don't think I really realized was that he's somebody who actually had a lot of trepidation about going on stage. He kind of had stage fright. And that, you don't realize that when you see him and how confident he is. But, he had this long process to prepare to get ready to go on stage. And part of it was physical, part of it was psychological. And I think part of it was just trying to sort of overcome his own anxieties about going on stage. And then to go out and deliver the kind of performances that he's so well known for. It came to just sort of appreciate even more how hard he worked and how much he put into it. He didn't want to just go out and play a concert. He wanted to deliver kind of like the albums, like the greatest concert you've ever been to. And so he really, his preparation for going on stage and his commitment to delivering, a superstar caliber performance each and every show was something that really stood out to me too.
I remember him talking about he wanted to destroy Appetite on the next album.
Yeah.
He was done with it, wanted to move on, and that's what they came up with. The introduction suggests that the band was already teetering on the edge internally with addiction and chaos surrounding them. The opening chapter, you describe how quickly fame changed the band's lives. How dramatically did success alter their relationships with each other?
Oh, tremendously. I mean, they were a band that lived together and wrote songs together and kind of fought their way to the top together. It was really this team, all for one and one for all. By the time we get to the very beginning of the Illusion era, it's starting to fall apart. They came home from the Appetite tour and everybody suddenly has money. And so they could go get their own place for the first time. They could get as many drugs as they wanted. They became sort of isolated from one another off into their own individual things. And I think by the time they got together in Chicago at the beginning to try to write songs for the Illusion album, it was just a completely different kind of vibe going on. Steven, of course, was having some major problems, and we see that at the beginning of the era. The incredible drummer for GNR was just not able to deliver the type of playing that he was famous for. And so one of the first problems they had was trying to figure out how to replace somebody who was so important to their sound, and also who was a brother. He and Slash went to high school together. They grew up together. And so I think there were some real difficulties in coming together and reformulating the group and sort of getting on the same page. By the time they get out on tour, things have really, they were kind of living in separate camps, so to speak, and with their own security teams and in their own kind of world. So yeah, it was a very different era for them than the Appetite era, and also everything that led up to it when they were really, together and a true team, I think.
One of the interesting things in the book that I was not aware of, but Axl, well, I knew he had songs going way back a ways. I know that November Rain was something that was on the early demos, but he had been thinking about basically the scale of Use Your Illusion around the time of Appetite, right? He was already thinking about that, thinking ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even in interviews you see in the early stages of Appetite, he was already talking about songs that they had set aside for the second album, and even talking about songs they were planning to use on the third album. So one of the things that I knew about November Rain and Don't Cry, he kind of says, and it's funny, when they first went out on tour, that we get this huge applause for November Rain because it was so heavily bootlegged. Everybody already knew the song. They knew all the words and everything else. This is before the albums are even out. So definitely there were some songs like November Rain, which had been around and heavily bootlegged. There was Don't Cry, which they played in clubs for years and demoed. And so they, Back Off Bitch, some of these other songs had been around. But I was surprised to learn that all the songs that I didn't know were dated back that far, even things like Perfect Crime or Dead Horse that I assumed were newly written for the Illusion albums. But, a lot of material went back. And of course, there was stuff like Yesterdays that was also The Garden. These are all songs that had been around in the wheelhouse for a while. I think one of the things that Axl decided to do was like, let's just record everything we got. If there's an old song, let's resurrect it. Let's bring it back. Let's record it. And we'll just put everything out there rather than pick and choose. Let's just, kind of dump it all. Now, for me as a fan, I really like that. I don't think there was a lot of filler on those albums, but certainly part of the plan was if there's a song, and whether it's an old song or a new song, let's record it and let's try to include it on this project.
Going back to that Chicago timeline, that's when they started to work on this album. You paint a pretty wild picture of Slash, Duff McKagan, and Steven Adler partying every night while the band was supposed to be writing a record. And read that section, it almost feels like there's two bands existing at the same time. You got one trying to write ambitious music, Axl, and another living the rock and roll party life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was Axl's idea for them to go to Chicago. He said, we need to go back to our Appetite methodology where we all live together, write songs together, collaborate around the clock, and basically become a band again. So this was Axl's idea. Everybody else was sort of like, all right, they went along with it, but it probably wasn't what they had in mind, for their second album. But everybody agreed, and there was some sense of like, all right, we really do want to top Appetite and make this happen. So Slash, Duff, and Steven get out there first, and Axl doesn't show up. So they're sort of waiting for him and they're rehearsing and, hitting the bars every night. And they're incredibly famous now too. And they're in Chicago, one of my second hometowns. And so they're partying, having a great time. And, eventually the partying starts to get out of control. Izzy was already pretty disengaged at this point. He was traveling around Europe. Eventually Axel shows up and they try to get to work, but they had brought a few songs. They had Civil War was a relatively new song they had started working on at the very end of the Appetite tour, but there was not a lot of new material generated in Chicago. Axel was working on November Rain and trying to get that going, but yeah, I mean they started to have problems right then, and by the time Izzy finally shows up, things were already kind of falling apart, and so Izzy was just like, I'm out of here. Axel ended up leaving eventually too, and Slash just said, I've had enough. I can't deal with this, and went back to LA. So yeah, Chicago was an attempt to to get things going and to get the songs begun, but ultimately it was kind of an experiment that didn't work out just because they couldn't get on the same page. And then of course they returned to LA and play this disastrous Stones concert too.
Right. Talk about that.
I was at that concert. That was my very first Guns N' Roses show, which is kind of a crazy show to go to, but it was the opening night of their concert and opening for the Rolling Stones in LA. It was the biggest hometown show they had ever played, one of the largest audiences they had ever played in front of. And there was so much excitement about that concert, but also a lot of controversy at that time. And, this was over the song One in a Million. I don't really retry the song in the book or talk too much about the Lies project, but this was certainly something that was affected those concerts a lot because there was a lot of controversy in the press about it. Living Colour talked about it on stage, and then ultimately Axl going out and starts not only talking about that, but effectively the band breaks up on stage. He announces right there at that concert, these are going to be the last Guns N' Roses shows you ever see, because there's too many people dancing with Mr. Brownstone. So it was an electric concert. I being there in the audience, it really felt like this is the most dangerous band in the world. The Rolling Stones were at one point the most dangerous rock band in the world. Well, now here's the new most dangerous band. The Stones were great, but by comparison, they were much more professional.
That was the Steel Wheels era.
Yeah, that was the Steel Wheels tour. First time I saw the Stones too. So I think the Stones actually did influence Axl a lot, though. Not long after that, he and Izzy played with the Rolling Stones in Atlantic City on their pay-per-view event. And I think that Axl seeing what a big mega tour looked like, professionally run, bunch of musicians on stage. Hey, the Stones have backup singers. They've got horn players. They've got multiple keyboard players. They have a big production, big sound, and they sound great. And I think that influenced his wanting those same things on the Illusion tour for himself, even the pay-per-view event, which they did from Paris.
So how soon after that did they go to Rumble Recorders in Canoga Park, California?
So that was sort of an attempt to go back to the Appetite studio, and they started doing that not long after the Stones shows. But they get there, and again, something that I didn't realize was that Steven actually recorded quite a bit of stuff with them, quite a bit of material for Illusion. I think Duff said they recorded 18 of the Illusion songs with Steven. We think of him as only doing Civil War, but they did record all these songs with him. They said they didn't sound good. He was in a complete stupor the whole time, and they just couldn't get it together. This is in the spring of 1990. And so they were working in there, but eventually they had to get rid of Steven. They tried to work it out with him, but eventually they, after the Farm Aid shows, that was it.
They brought back Mike Klink as producer, which is interesting because I just thought maybe with Axl wanting to go in a different direction, maybe he brings somebody else in. How did his role change on these albums? Did it because now we're talking about some leverage. Axl has some more power, I would think. So did he have more of the decision making?
I think so, but they trusted Mike Klink a lot. They had tried all these different producers on Appetite, and finally he was
Paul
the
Stanley.
guy who, yeah, right.
That story.
Yeah, Paul Stanley, incredibly, So finally they get Mike Klink, and he's the one who's able to deliver this. So I think there was some trust there. Um, I mean, one of the things that I thought was so fascinating was their process of recording, where they go in and record as a band without Axl, but the band records the song. It's got to be one take live with the band. I mean, if they mess up, if one note's played wrong, they just throw it out and do it again. But they didn't do it again that day. They only would play like one or two takes a day, even working very slowly and deliberately to try to find like this magic moment. So I think that they trusted Mike Klink. What was crazy to me was that is after that process of all the recording, Slash then erases all of his guitar parts and goes back and re-records everything that he played, which again, I didn't know that when I was researching the book. Quite a process to put together songs and to put together an album. And then after all the music was done, finally they bring in, Axl comes in and starts working on his vocals. And that was a crazy story too, because he moved into the studio.
Well, they had about 30 songs ready and it spanned their entire career pretty much. Like you mentioned, Don't Cry, You Could Be Mine had been around for years. Let's start with You Could Be Mine. If songs like November Rain represent that grand cinematic side of the Illusion albums, could You Could Be Mine be seen as the bridge back to that early GNR sound that fans first fell in love with?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, there were definitely a lot of songs that dated back to those days, and there's a lot of like hard rock songs on those albums. I mean, Axl wanted to deliver the most incredible album of all time, but for him, I think that included all kinds of different music as well. So you have, everything from like You Ain't the First, which is like an acoustic pirate song, to, hardcore straight up rockers like Perfect Crime, You Could Be Mine, which dated back to the Appetite era. They even had the lyric from You Could Be Mine written on Appetite. There was the line about with your bitch slap rapping and your cocaine tongue, you get nothing done. The lyric from You Could Be Mine was printed in the liner notes of Appetite for Destruction. Nobody knew at the time what it was, but then when that song came out, it's like, oh, that's where that comes from. So certainly that song was a bridge back to that world. And I don't think it's a surprise it ended up getting used as a kind of it wasn't the first single and the first piece of music to come out from the project, but it was kind of their introduction to the album. They wanted to put that song out and get it out to the world. And I think it's definitely one of the, 10 out of 10 great songs on that album.
Knocking on Heaven's Door, we know a cover of the Dylan track, but Live and Let Die, a cover of the Paul McCartney track. What made that song a good fit for GNR during that era?
What they said was that Axl and Slash really felt like that song fit their attitude. I think if you dig into the lyrics, like, well, live and let live, if somebody does something we don't like, live and let live. But for them, it's like, no, if somebody upsets us, then it's live and let die. That was sort of directed at the haters and the enemies. And so they felt like that song was a good fit for them. I think also, though, and I think you get this in the book, that Axl really wanted to align Guns N' Roses with not the heavy metal bands that they were sort of peers with when they came out, but the classic rock legends like Bob Dylan, like the Rolling Stones, like Paul McCartney. They brought Aerosmith and Jeff Beck to be guests with them. I think, and this is something Matt Sorum told me when I interviewed him. He said, Axl was such a smart guy. He really had this whole thing worked out with the two albums and how it couldn't be a double CD because he had worked at Tower Video and he understood that double CDs were put behind the counter and he wanted people to be able to touch the product. And also Matt said, he wanted to align us with these classic rock legends. And it's sort of, you are who you hang out with. And, Freddie Mercury would be another one, and playing the tribute to Freddie Mercury and things like that. So I think the use of Bob Dylan and Paul McCartney on the album was just another way of kind of furthering this goal he had of positioning Guns N' Roses in the class of, hard rock and classic rock legends rather than heavy metal bands and heavy metal legends. I think that was very much deliberate on Axl's part.
Let's talk about Matt Sorum.
Yeah.
So he had been playing with the Cult.
Yep.
What qualities did he bring that Axl and the band felt that they needed at that moment?
Yeah, it's a good question. He was a professional drummer. He was in a big band. They had just put out Sonic Temple, which was a big hit album that had, some Firewoman, a big hit song. So, and they had been out on tour and toured the world on that album. So Matt Sorum was a professional first and foremost. He could step in and from day one do the job. He wasn't going to be awed by playing in front of big crowds. This wasn't his first rodeo. He could record, he could do it all. So I think they really appreciated that. They had also seen him. Slash and Duff saw him perform with the Cult, went to that concert, were very impressed by him. So he was somebody who I think was kind of on their radar anyway, of like, yeah, this guy could actually step in and do the job. They had played with a few other people. They played with Martin Chambers from the Pretenders, for example, and said, yeah, just it didn't fit. Some people we tried, we couldn't find the right fit. Matt comes in and he's like one of the guys immediately. They could just, not only could he play and do everything, but he could also, sort of hang out and become one of the gang, so to speak. And I think they were looking for something like that too.
How would you describe his sound? I'm trying to, when I listen to him, he's got a massive Bonham-like sound. Also, that's the production, but he was just rock solid, like a machine.
Yeah. I mean, if you hear like Locomotive or something, I think that's a good example of the kind of like, he's really like, he is like a machine or something like that. His feel is very different from Steven Adler, and he's been criticized for that quite a bit. And I think it definitely changed the band's sound. There are some tapes that you can hear of Steven Adler rehearsing with the group on some of these songs, and it's like, wow, it's really pretty amazing sounding, and what could have been. But by the same token, I think that Matt's gave them a more cinematic style that really fit in with what Axl had in mind. I mean, Matt's drumming on November Rain, which I describe in the studio in how Axl came in and worked those parts out with him on November Rain, on Don't Cry, and on Estranged, and said, this is going to be a trilogy. You got to use the same fill on every one of these songs. And I want this symbol here and this to go here. And Axl and Matt very much worked out all the parts to that, in a studio one night. And I think that ultimately he was able to deliver exactly what Axl had in mind. He wanted this grand sort of Elton John, don't let the sun go down on me, sweeping sound, very cinematic, very large. It's different. It doesn't swing like Steven did. It doesn't have all his little hooks and turnarounds that he's so famous for. But it did give the group, I think, what Axl was looking for. And, I've been listening to these albums for 30 plus years, and I still think the songs hold up. I still think they're great. And I think Matt, you have to give him credit for his work on these albums. If I'm still listening to these songs and still like them, then it can't be like, oh yeah, I'm not sitting there going, oh man, I like these, bud. If only Steven were on this song. It's like, no, these are still great songs. You got to give him credit.
Now it feels right that he's on these tracks, but I'm glad you mentioned the fact that Axl sat down with him and said, these 3 songs, there's a theme here, a consistency, because I feel like I owe Matt Sorum, Matt, if you're listening to this, I owe you an apology, because a lot of fans were getting on him for, what's up with this same drum fill? Boom, 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 boom.
The Pat Boone, Debbie Boone.
Boom,
yeah,
boom,
right.
Boom, boom. And
right.
it just, I remember thinking myself, like, come on, man, what's the deal? You can't mix it up, right? And then I read an interview with him. He says, no, Axl wanted that.
Yeah, that he wanted this sort of a theme. And I agree. We all owe Matt Sorum a bit of an apology, because we've all said this, had this critique of him. But I was also, again, part of the process. He went in, they had the songs ready, and he learned a song a day for 30 days. They went into the studio and knocked him out in 3 weeks. And he's got to not only record the parts for 30 new songs, but they got to do it in one take. He can't go back and overdub or fix something. It's got to be a perfect take that he delivers too. So that he was able to learn those songs, go in and record them in 3 weeks in single takes was astonishing to me. I definitely didn't know that, So I feel like a lot of us owe Matt Sorum an apology, or at least, he deserves more credit than he's probably been given over the years.
A song like Locomotive, like you listen to the intro, it's just massive sound. It's like Bonham, but also that's the production too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. He was Yeah, in some ways, I mean, he was just driving the band like a good drummer does. And, again, his style was different, his sound was different, but I was just amazed at how he was able to go in and deliver so much in such a short period of time, go out on tour. I mean, they said he saved the band, we wouldn't have been able to do this without him. And
Why wasn't he part of this reunion with Slash and Duff?
the new one?
Yeah, the recent reunion from, now it's been 10 years, I think.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I think that, for whatever reason, Axel always saw him as kind of an employee or a hired hand. And, I think at the end of the tour, everything was off the table. Gilby was gone. Matt was gone. He was trying to decide what to do with Slash and Duff. And it's kind of amazing Dizzy hung on for all those years too. But Matt did get into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the rest of the band. And, I think he was an important part of their story for sure.
Jeff Harkness, the author of Estranged, Guns N' Roses, and Use Your Illusion. November Rain and Estranged pushed GNR into much more elaborate musical territory. Many fans associate these epic songs with Axl's vision. November Rain had actually existed in a demo. We talked about this for years, and the fans knew about it. Why did it take so long for the band to finally record it?
He saved November Rain. He saw that as, there was kind of some thinking about deciding between Sweet Child of Mine and November Rain. And everybody thought, let's save November Rain. Let's keep this for the second album because it's such an epic, amazing song. We want to really record it properly. I think Axl always wanted it done with a full orchestra, which eventually a few years ago, he got it done, with an entire orchestra. But I think for him, it was just such an important song that he wanted to save it and make sure that it got the care and treatment that he wanted it to have.
So it definitely wouldn't have worked on Lies then, because Lies was more stripped down.
Yeah, right. I mean, I love Lies just because he doesn't like double and triple his vocals. He's not, it's not like a ton of stuff on those tracks. It's very clean. And you really hear his voice come through. It's probably some of his like purest singing in some ways on the Lies tracks. But yeah, I think for him, he wanted this to be one of the centerpieces of the greatest sophomore album of all time.
Estranged is one of the longest and the most musically ambitious songs Guns N' Roses ever recorded. I think it's my favorite song off of the entire album, and Slash's guitar work on it, especially the second half of it with those guitar swells at the end and all that. It's beautiful. The structure almost feels like a mini rock opera. The lyrics feel extremely personal and reflective. How much of the song reflects what Axl Rose was experiencing emotionally during the Illusion era?
That song was one of his songs. I mean, he is the one who brought a lot of that to the project. Everybody else, Izzy brought his songs that are very Izzy sounding, and Slash had like the riff to Don't Damn Me and Bad Apples and some things that sound very much like Slash's guitar playing. But it was Axl who brought in these big epic songs like November Rain and Estranged, and he wrote the lyrics, and I think that they were incredibly personal and meaningful to him. He even talked about writing Coma, the lyrics to Coma, which Slash wrote the music to that, but Axl wrote the lyrics. And he said, like, putting himself into it and the work he had to do, he actually like almost passed out, when he was finally writing this, and finally it came out in this sort of cathartic thing. But I think he said he spent 6 months or 9 months, trying to get the words to Coma just right. His commitment to the art and the artistry was something that I don't think I appreciated until I really did the, researching on this project and how much work he put into it. I had like an Excel spreadsheet with everybody's contributions. And of the 28 original songs, we're going to exclude the Wings song and the Bob Dylan song. Of the 28 original songs on the album, Axl was a writer on 22 of them. So more than anybody else, he really was invested himself. He put so much time and energy and creativity into this project. I mean, he moved into the studio for, a couple of months to record his vocals. He was very committed in ways that I don't know if I fully appreciated or understood. And I think he was as committed. Slash, I think, was also very committed to the project and did amazing work in the studio. But I think, Axl's work ethic and desire for perfection and ambition to make this not just an album, not just a second album, but like one of the greatest albums of all time, a sweeping epic, was something that really, stood out to me as I was doing the research. And I think this really comes out in the book too.
Knocking on Heaven's Door, usually when you cover a song by a legendary songwriter like Bob Dylan, there's always a risk of comparison.
Yeah.
Do you think that they transformed it into something uniquely their own?
That's a great question. Being the big fan that I am, to me, when they played that in 1988 on the Ritz, and many people like me for the first time, I knew Bob Dylan. I didn't know that song. And it was mind-blowing. That performance, this is Appetite era, of course, on the Ritz, when they first played that song, was like so amazing. And that version they played was so good. It was such a revelation. To me, I was kind of disappointed in the studio version that they put on Illusion. If they were going to redo it, I think they probably, if they were going to put it on there, I think they probably should have just used that live version from '88 at the Ritz, because I don't think it gets better or rawer than that version. I think one critique that many have of Illusion is the production at times could be a little busy and a little slick. And to me, their version that ended up on Illusion was, something that didn't kind of live up to the greatness that they had made in that song. I think they transformed it in '88, but I think by the time they were doing Illusion, it was like, yeah, this is not it was never the song that for me I was excited to go hear, because it had kind of already been around for several years.
The people had been talking about it for a few years before Use Your Illusion. I mean, that was a well-known performance by them. And you're right. I think that's a better version of it, although the studio version is still solid. But I think,
for sure.
But I think you could say, I mean, they're like with Hendrix and All Along the Watchtower, there are people that prefer the GNR version over the Dylan version.
I certainly do, but I'm just going to go to that '88 version, from the Ritz, but I definitely think that their version is in some ways much more iconic than Dylan. Certainly for our generation, I think it is. Like I said, it wasn't a Dylan song I knew. I knew his big, popular songs, but when GNR did that, it was like, wow, what is this? And suddenly I'm going to look up the Bob Dylan version, and I think it started appearing on his greatest hits albums all of a sudden. It's sort of they revived that song in some ways, and I do think that they sort of outmatched the master on that one.
Don't Cry, one of the oldest songs in the Guns N' Roses catalog, written long before the Illusion albums. What's the story behind how Axl and Izzy Stradlin came up with the song?
That was one of their oldest songs. That was one of the first songs that they wrote for GNR. They were very influenced by Hanoi Rocks. And I think you really hear it in Don't Cry, especially if you go back to like the demo versions that predated Appetite for Destruction. It's really, in some ways, it's reminiscent of like Don't You Ever Leave Me and some other things that Hanoi Rocks did. I personally love that song. I think it's absolutely amazing. Even the demo version, when you hear it, you hear how A, what a great song it is, and B, what a great singer Axl was. Because even on the oldest demos, he really delivers an amazing vocal performance. And so I was thrilled that they ended up putting that on the song, on the album, and making a video out of the song too. It's an old song, but it definitely deserved a place on the record. And it doesn't surprise me that they issued a video for that in a single early on.
And it did really well. What's the story behind the alternate version?
So I'm not a fan of that. If there are a few songs that I think I would personally take off of Illusion if I was making the cuts. Not many, but that would probably be one of that would be one of the ones that I would take off. Axl in the studio one night came up with a completely new version of it. He had a different melody. He had different lyrics. He said it just came to him like instantly in this inspiration. So he says, to the engineers and Mike Klink, let's record this. Let's do this. He lays it down over the existing music. So the backing track is identical. It just has a different melody and different lyrics. And I think it's cool. It would have made a great B-side. But to me, to put two versions of the same song on the same album, I know they were on different Illusion albums, but on the same project, to me was that's an example of like, yeah, we probably could have lost that and it wouldn't have cost us anything.
I'm a huge Blind Melon fan. Shannon Hoon,
Yeah.
one of my favorites. So he's on Don't Cry. He is on Live and Let Die. He's on November Rain. You Ain't the First in the Garden. Actually, co-lead vocals on Don't Cry. Right. So
Yeah.
the story is interesting because his Axel's sister knew Shannon Hoon. They're both from Indiana.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Shannon just kind of showed up in LA and said, "Hey, I'm trying to make it in the business." And Axel said, "Why don't you come on in?"
Yeah, well, Axel would occasionally go back to Lafayette, Indiana, where they were both from, and through his sister, got to know Shannon Hoon a little bit. They actually did karaoke one night in a bar together in Indiana. And I think he said to him, hey, at this point, Shannon Hoon was already singing in a band. I think he said, hey, kid, if you ever come to LA, look me up. And Shannon Hoon was like, I'm going to book my tickets tomorrow. So Shannon does come out to LA. Axel does take him under his wing. He gets him a job with Ricky Rockman and his production company. He starts bringing him into the studio. He's introducing him to everyone around town. And Shannon puts together Blind Melon. They write 5 songs and get a major label record deal, just because of the connection to Axl Rose. And so, yeah, I think Axl always saw him as a bit of a protege, as a younger version of himself. He understood, what it was like to be a kid from Indiana with a big dream. And I think definitely Axl identified with Shannon Hoon and wanted to help him in any way he could. And I think you very much see his generosity in doing that and in recognizing Shannon Hoon's talent, but also in helping to introduce him, get him a job, hook him up with an apartment. Eventually gets a deal. GNR brings him out on tour. He was really, anytime they were in the same city, he would bring him on stage, and Shannon
put him in the video.
Yeah. He's in the Don't Cry video. So iconic on top of the building. Amazing. So, yeah, I think that there was a real friendship there. And Shannon repaid that. Axl was struggling and having a really hard time after his divorce from Aaron Everly. He was isolated. He was living in the studio. And Shannon moved in there for a while and lived with him and just made sure he was doing okay. So there was a real bond and a real friendship there. I mean, it comes a little later than this book covers, but I really wonder how hard that must have been for Axl when Shannon Hoon passed.
Yesterday's is one of the best on this double album, co-written by Axl Rose, Wes Arkeen, and Del James. So who are Wes Arkeen and Del James, and how did that whole collaboration come together?
These are old friends of the band. Wes Arkeen was a musician who they knew from the club days, and same thing with Del James. Del James was a writer, and he actually wrote the short story that they turned into the trilogy of videos for Don't Cry, November Rain, and Estranged. They're based on a short story called Without You by Del James. And I think that Wes Arkeen co-wrote It's So Easy. So he was a musician and a writer. And they said, hey, It's So Easy was a great song. What else do you have? And he had Yesterdays and he had The Garden. And so I think that they wanted to record those partially because they had success with one of his previous songs. And also they were looking for anything and everything to put on this album. So those two had written that song. It was another one that goes back a long time. There's footage of Axl singing it in, I think, 1989 in a club in New York and killing it, So that song had been around. I love it too. I think it's a great, great song and a great video. I didn't realize, again, something that was new to me. The same day that they recorded the video for Yesterdays, they recorded the video for Garden of Eden in the same location, same director. They were just like, hey, let's do a second video really quick. And a few takes later, they produced a second one. So there's the same microphone. You can tell it's the same mic.
I don't think I've ever seen Garden of Eden video.
Oh, yeah, it's great. It's very, it's like this like stop motion thing. It's very cool. Well, the director, Andy Morahan, loved the video, loved the song. And he said, man, let's just do a video for it real quick. And unlike November Rain and these kind of like Michael Jackson level thriller videos that they did, this was done in like just a few takes late one night after they had already shot another video. they put it together and it's killer. It's in some ways it's just as iconic as the other ones, even though it's very short and was done in kind of like one take, basically. I think they used one take.
Thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. I've been listening to both of these albums a lot since I started reading the book, getting ready for the interview, but I had forgotten about a lot of those tracks. And I remember I thought, again, maybe I need to apologize, but I just, I loved all the songs on the radio, and I liked a few of the other ones that weren't on the radio. And I said, I was kind of lukewarm on the others, but now listening back to it years later, maybe I just needed time away from it. And I realized, I'm like, well, there's a lot of good stuff in here.
Oh yeah.
Dustin
There's
Bones
a ton of great material for putting out, 2.5 hours of music, I mean, almost all of it is just outstanding.
The chapter title itself, Where's Izzy, suggests how central Izzy Stradlin had been to the band. What led to his departure? He just lost interest, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he just didn't want to be in a giant mega band. He wanted something more like the Juju Hounds that he put together afterwards, something just we can go play clubs and it's all low key. I think he didn't like traveling on a jet airplane like they did. He didn't like the large yes. He didn't like the excess. I mean, at the beginning of the book, Izzy's still partying with the rest of the band, but famously he got arrested for urinating on an airplane, and part of his court terms was that he was going to be drug tested on a regular basis for like a year. So he had to give up drugs completely. And I think that was a big change for him. I think he said it was very difficult to be around this band as somebody who wasn't using drugs. It's not just like, oh yeah, you do you and I do me. He shows up for rehearsal and they're offering him some cocaine and stuff like that. And he's like, guys, I'm going to like literally be in jail if I get busted again. So I think partially it was sobriety really changed things for him. But I think also just what the band became, which he writes about and pretty tied up, once there was this rock and roll band rolling on the street, time went by and it became a joke. And, what a punch in the face line. But I think that's really how he saw it. Like, we were this great street level rock and roll band, and we turned into, this kind of cliche of a rock and roll band with all the drugs and all the groupies and all the sex and the jet airplanes and, so on and so forth. I think it just wasn't for him.
Well, I guess that answers the question as to why he didn't rejoin Axl, Duff, and Slash when they reunited.
Yeah, well, there seemingly was a lot of water under the, bad water under the bridge. Interestingly, and this, I remember this from the time, but, he did reunite with the band during the Illusion tour. After he left, he came back and played 5 dates with them. Gilby Clarke broke his hand in a motorcycle wreck. They needed somebody to fill in. Who are we going to get? Let's get Izzy. And he agreed to it. So he played 5 shows with them in Europe, much later in the Illusion tour. And by all accounts, that didn't go well either. The band was upset. They felt like he didn't prepare, and that he, they were playing their old songs, but he hadn't like sat down and worked on them at all. So he wasn't really up to speed. And they felt like he didn't really give a great performance. When he went back, he said, nothing's changed. These guys are still on drugs. They're practically living on another planet. He said, if anything, it's only gotten worse since I was with the band. So I think that was part of the reason too, that he always felt like there were money issues, but they did this short reunion, and, it's an interesting 5 shows that they did together. But I think in some ways that really was the end, for Izzy. He has, joined the band here and there, but those were the last full shows he ever played with the band. Yeah.
That explains why in 2016, I was just looking 2016, I guessed correctly 10 years ago was that reunion.
Right.
This Lifetime tour that I don't know if they even asked him, or it was just a foregone conclusion. He's not going to want to do it anyway. So let's not even.
I think they did ask him, but
Did
he didn't like the money they were offering is kind of what.
Okay. So they did. Okay. Yeah. It would have been great to see him up there.
I agree. I'm a huge Izzy fan. I love Izzy. And, if you're a Guns N' Roses fan from the Appetite days, it's hard not to be a huge Izzy fan too.
When the two Illusion albums were released on the same day in 1991, I remember critics, they were divided. Like some of them praised the ambition. Others thought the albums were bloated. Why do you think the reviews are so mixed at the time, and have opinions changed over the years by critics?
Well, I mean, double albums are often criticized for that reason. There's so much material and, inevitably somebody's going to think there's filler on it. Even me, who's like, I'm a huge fan of these. I think they're masterpieces. I would even say, yeah, there's probably a couple of songs that I might cut off of there. So I think double albums always get nailed with that critique of there's just too much. It should have been cut down to a single album. They couldn't, make any decisions or rein themselves in. And then also, I think that the production was very different on these albums. Something that, again, when I was going back and really deeply listening to them again, and at least listening to Appetite and Lies also, I realized, as much as people talk about Matt Sorum changing the band sound, I think it was Dizzy Reed who really changed the band sound more than anything else. And he didn't play all the piano. Axl played the piano on some of those songs, but bringing in a piano and bringing in also keyboard and organ, synthesizers and strings and all that kind of stuff, all of these keyboard instruments that they brought in, I think really changed the band sound more than anything else. And so I think for some people, fans and critics, that was off-putting. Like, this doesn't sound like the same band. They often blame Matt for that. But I think also, one of the big differences was just using so much piano. Even a song like Bad Obsession, which is like a rocker, it's got this, I think really good piano on it, this kind of Stonesy piano. There's nothing like that on Appetite for Destruction. And so you don't get that, punch you in the face hard rock band that was the Appetite era band. You get an expanded version of that with a lot more piano and a lot more organ and stuff like that on the track. So I think for those two reasons, one, there's just a lot of material here, and double albums are always criticized for that. And then two, the change in the band's sound, I think, which was Matt Sorum, Dizzy Reed, and all of the piano instruments, and just the largeness of the production. There was, I said in some ways, Slash and Axl, as they wanted this to be amazing, and it was. In some ways, they almost over-delivered at times. It's like, yeah, you maybe didn't need to put, 78 guitar tracks on this one song. Just mixing all of the tapes and trying to figure it out was quite a project. They could almost not find a studio that would handle the amount of material they had recorded on all the tracks. You might have 24 vocal tracks from Axl, and then, another 24 guitar parts from Slash and the basic tracks. And so trying to cram all of this material onto, a single song, sometimes it came across as a bit overstuffed compared to, especially Lies, but also Appetite too.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. In fairness, Axl made it clear to the fans it's not going to be an Appetite Part 2. He said that back in like 1989. I remember an MTV
100%.
interview. So, and commercially, it was a huge success. And you look at Use Your Illusion 2 had most of the hits on it. So I would think it'd be interesting to see the sales of 1 and 2. I would think 2 sells more. It's got You Could Be Mine, Knocking on Heaven's Door, Yesterday's Civil War, and Estranged. However, 1 has less hits per se, but it's got November Rain on there. Don't Cry.
And the first Don't Cry also is on
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
Don't Cry, Live and Let Die, November Rain are the
Yeah.
3 singles on there. Now,
Well, when they came out, two entered the charts at number one, and the Red and Yellow entered the charts at number two. So two did sell a little bit better originally. I think in the end it probably evened out over the years.
but they did like Springsteen did with Human Touch and Lucky Town, separate. You didn't have to buy them together.
Less successfully, I would say.
Oh yeah.
But combined, they sold 35 million copies, around the world over the years. So it was definitely a success for them. The record company earned back their money, and in the end, I think everybody was happy. And they made history when they did that. When Springsteen did that, he was pulling a GNR. And so never in history had a band put out two complete albums on the same day, as completely separate projects like that. And that was Axl's idea, 100%. The record company certainly didn't want that. And everyone questioned it and said, why are we doing this? But he made history when he did it. And I think he was vindicated for that.
Well, you mentioned money. So one of the striking themes here is that despite selling millions of records and filling arenas, the band actually didn't make as much money from the tour as people might expect. The massive scale of the Illusion tour, how did that create its own problems?
Well, they just spent so much money. They had a huge entourage. They flew around in a jet. Everybody in the band had their own bodyguard. They brought a masseuse. They brought a chiropractor. They brought a psychiatrist on the tour with them. Axl's brother and sister were on the tour. So they have a jet airplane. They're staying in the finest hotels in the world. They have a massive stage production with a huge crew. They were having $100,000 parties every night. They were on the Metallica tour. Axl gave his brother a budget, $100,000 a night. I want you to throw the most amazing parties backstage that have ever been seen. Each one had their own theme. We're going to have a casino night. We're going to have a 60s night. We're going to have a disco night. And, when you spend that kind of money out on the road, when you add it all up at the end, there's just not a lot left, and so they were kind of surprised that at the end of
but
tour
it does
cycle,
sound like a lot of fun.
It
sounds like it may have been worth it.
Yeah, it was the most amazing. This is one of the things that drew me to writing this book is what a story. Nobody's ever done anything like this. And Axl said, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't look like the Rolling Stones. We need parties. I want casinos. I want money for people to gamble. I want slot machines. And I mean, the amount of money that they spend, giant feasts every night, and a crew of almost 200, and everybody's on a jet airplane, and everybody's staying at the Four Seasons, and it was the amount of money that they spent was insane. They made a ton of money, but man, they burned through a lot of it too.
Sure. Do you see anything in the Illusion sessions, particularly Axl pushing for the orchestration, the technology, the massive arrangements that foreshadows the direction that he would eventually take with Chinese Democracy? Because I think I know what you're going to say here. I have a particular song that.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's a great question. And yes, I think My World is the one that really looks forward to Chinese Democracy. But he was also in there with these banks of synthesizers doing all the strings. He would spend hours picking out like the perfect, string sound. And he was very into the synthesizers and the keyboards, not just on My World, but on these other tracks. That's how My World came to be. He was working in there on these, electronic, instruments, and that was all him. And he said, well, let's put together, a little kind of 9 Inch Nails, Faith No More epic, NWA, mashup. And that became My World. It was really done as a lark, but
I always liked it.
I did too. I always thought it was cool,
liked it. Yeah. It's only like a minute and 25 seconds.
It's very short. If you don't like it, you can ignore it. It comes at the very end. And
but that's what's at the very end, kind of like a hint, like is where I'm going next. Right.
Yeah. Right. Well, in some ways you could foreshadow where he was going. And, I'm a big fan of the Chinese Democracy Project. I think his singing, on that album is incredible. If you're a fan of Axl's singing, in some ways, some of the stuff he does on that album, like Street of Dreams, for example, is as good as anything he ever did. And he did write one song, This I Love, on the Illusion tour. They played it, not the entire song, but they played, he would go out and play on the piano and played some of that a few times in the last shows. So he had written This I Love for Stephanie Seymour on the Illusion tour, and that eventually came out on that album. So you could see some hints of where he wanted to go. He was a big Nine Inch Nails fan. He brought them on tour before anybody had really heard of them. And he loved, I think he really loved Faith No More because one, they used a keyboard. And then two, like if you listen to something like Epic, which was their huge hit, you know, it was really bringing in, you know, you have keyboard, you have heavy metal, you have rap going on in there, a little bit of everything. It was such an innovative song. So I think that he was very much wanting to get away from, you know, the classic hard rock kind of thing that Slash did, or even Izzy did with the Juju Hounds. And I think he was looking, he wanted to bring in Dave Navarro as the guitar player for the band. Even when they got Gilby, he was really wanting Dave Navarro and wanting to go in that direction of, like, you know, cutting edge music, I think was what he wanted to do.
When people talk about the golden age of Guns N' Roses, they almost always mean the Appetite and Illusion years. I guess what comes to mind looking back on that era, particularly the Illusion years, because you've written a book about it. So what do you think about those years in terms of rock history?
Well, that's what gave them their legacy. That's what put them in the status of the true legends, and I think accomplished what Axl wanted to do, which was they're like, I mean, especially today, they're like a Queen or an Elton John or Rolling Stones. You know, they're not the same thing as, let's say, a Motley Crue, you know, for example, who also came out of the Sunset Strip and is a legendary band as well, but wouldn't probably be in that same conversation as the, you know, the sort of classic rock legends that Axl wanted to join. I think it was Illusion that enabled that. And because of the artistry, the scope, the huge songs, the epic ballads, the, you know, the strings, the incredible music videos, you know, I see these articles about, like, we're going to look at this batshit crazy $4 million video GNR recorded back in the day. And I'm always like, you should be like giving props to that incredible video instead of, like, you know, making fun of it. You know, to me, it's like, this is incredible. No, you know, you don't see bands do anything like this now. As you said, like, even that tour, you know, when they're having $100,000 parties, it's like nobody does what they did anymore. You know, these kind of, like, that level of rock and roll, whatever you want to call it, artistry, creativity, a band swinging for the fences and connecting, you know. I love it when a great band swings for the fences, you know. Sometimes they hit it out of the park and sometimes they don't. But
we had you on for your U2 book.
I was going to say, it reminds me of you too.
The album Pop.
They just want to, you know, really deliver something that is, you know, mind blowing and trying something totally new. I think, you know, probably the difference here is GNR actually delivered. They hit a home run with it, you know, and to me, that gave them a legacy that they wouldn't have had if they had fallen apart after Appetite, you know, which I suppose could have happened. You know, it could have been a different story, but because of Illusion, they're in that conversation of the legendary, I think, classic rock bands instead of the legendary heavy metal bands.
And I think it's also because of its success. That was the big what if. Like, what if they can? I mean, Spaghetti Incident did come out shortly after, but we saw the band dissolve and it just ended. And what could have been, you know, if they stayed together.
Right. And I mean, also the Spaghetti Incident's part of this book and part of this story and part of the Illusion era. You know, something I maybe kind of knew this, but I didn't appreciate how much that album, 100% of it was recorded during the Illusion era. A lot of it was recorded during the recording of Use Your Illusion. They would just go into the studio and bang out these covers for fun without anybody kind of looking or paying attention. And they started collecting them. And then as they're out on tour, they would book a studio and go in somewhere. Eventually, Axl ordered that all of Izzy's guitar tracks be erased, which is unfortunate. And Gilby went in and in one day replaced them all and added himself to the project. So we hear Gilby on an album too. And that came out at the very end, right after the tour. But I included the spaghetti incident in this book because it is also part of the same story. And so you can't talk about the spaghetti incident without talking about Use Your Illusion, because all of those tracks were recorded either in the studio at the same time or later on the tour. And 100% of it was done by when they got back. Slash just mixed it and they put it out.
The Booked on Rock podcast is part of the Boneless Podcasting Network. If you're a fan of classic rock and classic film like I am, go to boneless.lovable.app to find over 20 great shows there. That's boneless.lovable.app, or just go to bookedonrock.com, the Boneless Podcasting Network. It is what you want it to be. Listen with confidence. Well, congratulations. It's another home run book here. Estranged, Guns N' Roses, and Use Your Illusion. It's out now. Find it wherever books are sold, right? Look for it at your nearest bookstore.
Absolutely.
Yeah, independent bookstores. Hopefully they have one there. Go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. And people can find you online, Jeff, where?
Well, there is a Facebook page for the book, so come there, sign up. One of the things I did was put together a YouTube playlist, chronological, with every single video, every demo, every outtake, every weird newscast, every single show on the tour. It's 300 plus videos in chronological order. So come on to my Facebook page. There's a link there. You can watch the videos and watch all of this crazy stuff. Axl giving away his condo on MTV while you are reading the book. And so come on there and join the party. It'd be great to see everybody.
Yeah, thanks for letting me know. I'll find the link. I'll sign up, and then I'll put it in the show notes for people to access it a lot easier. Jeff Harkness, always love having you on, man. You always give great interviews. The enthusiasm for these artists, it comes through. And like you've said in your interviews, if you're going to do a book, it's got to be on a band you love, that you have a passion for, and it comes through.
Well, thank you so much. And yes, if I'm going to spend a couple years, digging in on this level, it's got to be a band that's just near and dear to my heart. And I always knew I would write a book about GNR, and I'm so glad that I did. And it's great to come on here and talk about it with you too. I'm excited to be here. So thank you so much for having me.
That's it. It's in the books.